When the vast pine forests of Michigan were first surveyed in the 1840s, it was found there were 170 billion board feet. A board foot is 1 inch thick and a foot square. This figure is a little easier to imagine when you think of it as enough to build 10 million six-room houses. These would hold all of the families in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Or to look at it another way, enough lumber to cover the entire surface of Michigan with a floor of pine 1 inch thick. The heaviest and best stands of what was called the state's green gold was found in a belt that ran across most of the whole lower peninsula, from Lake Michigan to Lake Huron. But there was also another massive stretch of excellent pines farther north and in the upper peninsula. It was said that a pine squirrel could climb up a tree in Maine and head west, going from branch to branch through New England, New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, without ever having to put its feet on the ground. The wood of the white pine is what was preferred by the logging companies and by the people. It was a nice, creamy white color, lightweight, and when logs were dropped into the rivers, they floated high in the water. And there were other advantages. These trees were huge, some as tall as 170 feet, almost equal to a 17-story building. They had a long trunk up to the first limb. The largest on record still standing in Michigan today is the Monarch. It's 155 feet high, and there are 74 feet between the first limb and the ground. The largest of our pines were tiny seedlings when the Pilgrims landed over 300 years ago. Pine-covered land could be bought for $1.25 an acre in the first years of our statehood. The timber on the best of these acres was worth at least $150. The men who started the first camps had very little money, and the buildings were crude and quickly thrown together. They held about 24 men and probably 3 or 4 teams of horses or oxen. Production was small, and the camps had to be located near rivers. In some cases, the man who owned the timberland put up the camp himself, hired a few men, and logged the best timber. But most logging was done by jobbers who were hired by landowners who had bought the land as an investment, and they knew nothing about logging themselves. It was fortunate for the loggers that the state is so well furnished by nature with a network of rivers and streams that are deep enough to float logs, and they flow from the interior out to the Great Lakes, where they could be processed and loaded onto ships. One of the main tools of the early years was the double-edged axe. It took hundreds of swings to get a deep enough groove to cause the giant pines to crash to the ground. After a day of swinging this heavy piece of iron, the men developed great strength. This wasn't only a time of home and factory building in the upper Midwest. The needs of the growing business of copper and iron mining had to be satisfied, with great quantities of wood also. These didn't have to be the best pines, but often they were. The timber was used to shore up the tunnels to prevent cave-ins, and hundreds of miles of shafts and tunnels were carved out of the earth in the Upper Peninsula. The many buildings used in mining were also made of wood. Before logging started as a commercial business, a crude and difficult method was used to turn logs into lumber. 2 men pulled and pushed what was known as a pit saw. Loggers knew it would be months or even years to saw their logs into lumber at their own camps, so they floated them to the mills. The trip to the mills began at a place called a landing, where the logs were piled after being trimmed and hauled from the place where they had fallen. This was a winter-long process, and big stacks were seen everywhere by spring. Just as the cattlemen branded steers, the logging companies had to put their own identification mark on the logs. Then there was no question of ownership when many brands were mixed together in the river drives. This practice is still continuing today, but today the brand is usually burned into the boards, and everything is done by a machine. No longer are they pounded into the fiber with a mallet by a powerful lumberjack. Various methods were used to move the big logs once they were felled. One system employed a huge set of wheels. The axle was so high off the ground, the log could be trussed up underneath and then not bang on the stumps or rocks. The oxen were slow but powerful. They were used as a team or singly to pull the individual logs from the place they were cut down to the landing. Horses were more common, and some camps had as many as a dozen good teams. They were dependable and hard-working, and the camps simply could not have operated without them. Traveling in the North Country in winter, one could see just how active and productive the camps had been, and the foreman anxiously watched the weather from the frozen banks of the Tittabawassee, the Black, Manistee, Rifle, Grand, Flint, the Escanaba, the Tiquamagun, and various other rivers. Though there was nothing that could be done about it, the companies worried whether it would be a spring with too much water. This would toss their logs into the woods above the riverbanks, or if there was too little water, the timber would end up getting hung up on the rocks. Companies had to build and maintain a floating cook shanty called a wanigan. The men making the drives demanded that their own cook go along. The wanigan floated down behind the logs so as not to get marooned in a jam. At the height of logging, special businesses called boom companies formed to handle the many brands passing down the busier river. In 1887, the Tittabawassee Boom Company had to sort out more than 1,100 brands. While floating free, and before being tied or herded together in a raft, the logs sometimes totally covered the surface of a river in a jam. They stretched for as much as 5 miles, and sometimes only dynamite could free them. The age of the gas-powered saw did not come along until after the heyday of logging. It was still a dependence on human muscles. Two-man or buck saws were good for their time, but painfully slow by today's standards. Up to about 1880, the forests of Michigan were logged only in winter. It was the only time the heavy logs could be moved over the ground. In fact, the roads were coated with ice from a special water wagon. This made it possible for the horses to move even bigger loads. In the 1870s, the picture changed drastically and quickly. It was the coming of the railroad engine that made this a year-round business. It also allowed for cutting deep into the state's heartland, where there were only the shallow rivers or none at all to move the logs. While this was good for the companies, it was not good for the forest. Now, everything could be cut, and vast areas were cleared of every stick of timber. Stands that were partly cut over in horsepower days were now harvested over once more, never again to return to their productive forests they had been. There was no thought of controls, and no such thing as environmental concern. It was a young Newaygo County man who first thought of the idea of using steam engines in the forest. Winfield Jerish began logging when only 18, when he worked along the shallow Muskegon River tributaries. This caused him to have many problems. When Jerish put in a 6-mile-long track for his logging site down to the main channel of the Muskegon River, other logging companies thought that he had a case of shanty fever. Some laughed outright at him or even booed at his tiny Lake George and Muskegon River Railroad. But during the first year, his 2 engines and 50 cars moved 500,000 board feet a day, and those who laughed were struggling with the poorest sledding conditions in years. And then they joined him, and a dozen years later, there were 90 different logging railroads in Michigan. More so than many realize, it was the coming of these railroads that opened up much of the state to settlers. As the trains carried passengers and their freight and built depots, more and more people decided to try rural life away from the big cities. The logging lines didn't operate without their share of problems. There were derailments and accidents of all kinds. Rails sometimes sunk out of sight into the muskeg swamps. There were also forest fires started by the sparks from these wood burners. Before commercial logging began in the northern part of the state, in the pines, small sawmills were ripping through the hardwoods in all of the counties in the bottom half of Michigan. More than 400 such mills when we became a state. The first sawmills were operating even before that. They were water-powered, and they were mostly in the Detroit area. Their daily output was very small. The first to be run by steam is thought to have been the Palmer in St. Clair County in the year 1826. Most of the mills were built alike, two-story buildings next to the water. A chain belt pulled the logs to the second level where they were then cut. The bark, the chips, and the useless trim all went into a nearby furnace. Many different blades were used: the circular saw, the English or gate saw, the whip saw, and so on. One looked like a huge bakery saw. Like a loaf of bread, the log was sliced in many strips at the same time. And always there was the man who spent his whole day sharpening the blades that were dulled quickly. Logs that held river mud dulled the teeth, and the dirtier timber had to be washed before cutting. But the great pine forests could not possibly last forever. There was great overuse. The end of the era came not long after the turn of the century. Men and companies usually moved west to Wisconsin, to Minnesota, or way out to the western states. And behind them they left a legacy of old stumps and ugly barren areas where the pines once enriched the beauty and the value of our land. Soil that supported the trees was much too poor for farming, and people who tried plowing and planting failed and moved on. Erosion was now free to spread. Though the land will never totally recover from the shock, the forests are starting to return, largely in the 25 state and national forests. Half of the state's landmass is listed as forested. Today, Michigan people are much more concerned and will never again allow the old policy of cut and run to exist in Michigan.